13 years before that lawn went silent, a smaller river called the Esk below curled past a village called Hollow Reach, and on its bank stood a leaning wooden cottage where Wynne Thorne, aged 12, was teaching her little brother to float. Her own father had taught her the very same way years before, when she was small enough to fit entirely along his forearm while he walked her through the shallows. A ferryman's daughter who can't swim is no use to anyone, least of all herself, Garrick Thorne used to say, half joking, half deadly serious, the way men say the truest things they believe. He had taught her the long, even stroke that cut through current instead of fighting it, the trick of reading water by its color and its sound before ever touching it, the patience to let a river carry you sideways rather than spend yourself fighting straight across it. She had absorbed it the way children absorb anything taught with love, completely, and without ever once imagining she might need it to save a life, let alone two, in two different rivers, 13 years apart. "Stop fighting it," she told him, one hand flat under his thin back, the water cold around her knees. "The river isn't your enemy, Toby. It only fights you if you fight it first." Tobias Thorne was 9, all elbows and freckles, with a laugh too big for his small chest. He trusted his sister completely, the way younger brothers do when their sister has, for as long as they can remember, been the one who fixes things. Their mother had died birthing a third child who did not live either. Their father, Garrick Thorne, was a ferryman, gone most days poling his flat boat across the wide water for a few coins a trip, leaving Wynne to raise her brother in the gaps between chores. Toby followed her everywhere, copying the way she stood, the way she whistled to call the chickens, the particular tilt of her chin when she was determined about something. At night, when their father was late returning, she would tell him stories by the fire about the river itself. How it had once been a giant, she said, who lay down to rest and forgot to get back up, and how that was why it never hurried, except when something made it angry. Toby believed every word of it. He believed, too, with the complete and uncomplicated faith of a small brother, that his sister could fix anything the world broke. There had been a market day, once, the spring before he died, when their father had earned enough from a week of good ferrying to buy each of them a twist of sugared almonds from a traveling cart. Toby had eaten his in 3 bites, and then sat watching Wynne eat hers slowly, 1 almond at a time, until she finally broke and gave him the last 2. "You always give me the last bit of everything," he had said, not as a complaint, but as a simple observation, the way children notice love without yet having a word for it. She had told him it was because she liked watching him happy more than she liked sugared almonds, which was true, and which she would think of often in the years after he was gone. How easily she had given away the last of every sweet thing, and how she would have given away every year of her own life twice over to have kept him standing on that riverbank a moment longer. She loved that river. She loved it the uncomplicated way a child loves something dangerous before she has been taught to fear it. She knew its moods, its slow green Sundays and its furious brown Tuesdays after rain. She thought, foolishly, that knowing a river meant it could never surprise her. It surprised her on an ordinary Thursday in October. The flood came up fast, the way autumn floods do, no warning but a smell of churned mud and a sky gone the color of a bruise. Toby had gone down to the bank alone to fetch the line of fish traps before the water rose, because Wynne had asked him to, because she had been tired, because she had wanted 10 more minutes of sitting by the fire. She heard him scream from inside the cottage and was running before she had finished hearing it. By the time she reached the bank, he was 40 feet out, caught in a current that had not existed an hour before, his small arms already tiring. Wynne went in without a thought for herself, the way she would, 13 years later, go in for a different drowning child on a different river, while 200 strangers watched and did nothing. She almost reached him. Her fingers brushed his sleeve once, twice, and then the current took a hard turn around the bend, and it took her brother with it, and her hand closed on nothing but cold water and rain. Men from the village came with lanterns and ropes that first night, wading the shallows, calling Toby's name into the dark until their voices went hoarse. Wynne stood on the bank for hours, refusing every blanket offered her, watching the black water for any sign at all, certain, the way only a frightened child can be certain, that if she simply looked hard enough, the river would give him back. It did not. The second day brought more searchers, and the third day brought fewer, the way hope always thins before it disappears entirely. And on the morning of the third day, a fisherman 2 miles downstream found a small shoe caught in willow roots, and then, not far from it, the rest. They found Tobias 3 days later, a mile downstream, tangled in the roots of a willow tree. Wynne did not speak for 2 weeks. Her father, aged 10 years in a single autumn, his big ferryman's hands shaking now when he poled the boat, his eyes gone somewhere far away that never fully came back. He never once said it was her fault. He did not need to. She said it to herself, every single night, in the dark, for years. She remembered, with a particular sharpness of grief, The morning 2 weeks after the funeral, when her father had finally gone back out on the water for the first time because there was no money for bread otherwise, and how he had stood on the bank for nearly an hour before he could make himself step into the boat, his shoulders shaking in a way she had never seen a grown man shake. She had stood at the cottage window and watched him, wanting to go to him and not knowing what she could possibly say, and in the end she had simply stayed inside because she could not bear to watch his face if he turned around and looked at her and she saw, confirmed at last, the things she already believed about herself. "I should have gone with him," she whispered to the river itself, sitting alone on the bank long after the funeral, long after her father had stopped being able to look at the water without his face crumpling. "I should have been faster. I should have held on." The river did not answer. Rivers never do. They only keep moving, indifferent and patient, carrying away whatever falls into them, returning nothing but grief and silence, and sometimes, years later, a body washed pale and small against a willow root. Wynne grew up fast after that, in the particular way children do when grief arrives before they are ready for it. She learned to read from the vicar's wife in exchange for mending. She learned arithmetic from a tinker who passed through twice a year and was startled each time by how quickly the ferryman's daughter understood numbers most grown men struggled with. She learned, most of all, to carry her guilt the way her father carried his, quietly, privately, beneath a calm surface, the way a deep river hides its coldest current an inch below water that looks, from the bank, perfectly still. Garrick Thorne never fully recovered, in the years that remained to him. He kept ferrying because there was no other way to keep them both fed, but he took the long way around the bend where Toby had gone under, every single crossing for the rest of his life, adding nearly a quarter-mile to every trip rather than past the spot directly. Wynne noticed this and never once mentioned it, understanding instinctively that some griefs need their own private rituals to survive, and that naming them aloud only makes them heavier to carry. She inherited that same instinct without realizing it, the quiet, unspoken detour around the parts of a life too painful to look at directly, and would carry it with her for years after he was gone, long after she had a new name and a new river, and no one left alive who remembered the old one. When her father died of a winter fever 4 years later, 16-year-old Wynne stood at his graveside in a borrowed black dress and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was now entirely alone in the world, with nothing to her name but a debt to the boat hire man and a stroke through water that no one in any drawing room would ever think to call elegant. She did not yet know that this would be the exact thing, one terrible and beautiful day, that would save a stranger's life, and very nearly cost her everything she had built, to bury who she truly was. Mrs. Ainsley Pemberton found Wynne 6 months after Garrick Thorne's death, mending linens in the back room of a dressmaker's shop in the market town of Esk Hollow. Her fingers fast and precise, her face composed in a way that struck the older woman as entirely wrong for a girl of 16 who had buried her whole family. "You read?" Mrs. Pemberton said, not a question, watching Wynne's eyes follow the words on a discarded newspaper while she stitched. "Where did a dressmaker's girl learn to read like that?" "The vicar's wife taught me, ma'am, in exchange for mending." Mrs. Pemberton was a widow of considerable means and no children, with sharp eyes that missed very little and a loneliness she rarely admitted even to herself. She had buried a husband and outlived 2 sisters, and something about the watchful, grieving girl with the perfectly straight spine reminded her of a version of herself that had existed a long time ago and been quietly erased. "Come live with me," she said. "I will teach you what you do not know, and you will keep an old woman company, and we will tell no one where you came from. The world is unkind to girls with nothing, my dear. It is far kinder to girls with a story." It was, Wynne would understand only years later, an act of tremendous mercy and a small necessary lie all at once. Mrs. Pemberton invented a tale of distant, impoverished gentry, a niece of a niece, genteel blood gone thin with bad luck, and dressed Wynne in it the way she dressed her in good wool and careful posture, until the lie fit so well that Wynne herself sometimes forgot, for whole afternoons, that it was not true. She learned French. She learned the correct fork. She learned to dance, to embroider, to make conversation about nothing at all for 20 unbroken minutes. She learned, above everything else, to never once mention a river, a boat, a brother, or a stroke through water that no lady of quality would ever need. She remembered, with something close to fondness, the afternoon Mrs. Pemberton had tried to teach her the waltz, and had ended up laughing so hard at Wynne's stiff, terrified posture that she had to sit down on the settee and fan herself for a full minute before continuing. "You hold yourself like you expect the floor to give way beneath you," Mrs. Pemberton had said, wiping her eyes. "A lady dances as though she has never once in her life been afraid of falling, even when she is utterly certain she will." It was, Wynne would understand only much later, advice that applied to a great deal more than dancing, and she had carried it with her into every ballroom, every dinner, every careful performance of a life she had not been born into. The transformation did not happen all at once. There were whole months in those early years when Wynne caught herself reaching for a sentence in the cadence of hollow reach and had to swallow it back, when her hands itched for rough work and found only embroidery, when she lay awake counting the ways she might be discovered before breakfast. Mrs. Pemberton noticed these nights. She always noticed, and would simply sit with her, saying nothing useful, only holding her hand until the panic passed, the way Wynne herself would years later learn to sit with other people's fear without needing to fix it. Beneath the lessons, the guilt never left. It simply learned to sit very still, the way she had learned to sit still in drawing rooms, present but invisible, an ache she carried the way she carried good posture, automatically, constantly, at terrible cost. There had been one close call in her second year with Mrs. Pemberton that she never spoke of afterward. A kitchen boy had slipped on the icy steps down to the ornamental pond and gone under the thin December ice before anyone else had even registered what was happening, and Wynne had been across the lawn and onto the ice before her mind caught up with her body, breaking through with her bare hands and hauling the boy out by his collar with a strength that startled the gardeners watching. Mrs. Pemberton had arrived moments later, taken one look at her ward's soaked sleeves and the unnatural calm on her face, and quietly told the staff that the young miss had simply reached him with a fallen branch. No one questioned it. Wynne had understood, in that frozen, dripping moment, exactly how thin the wall around her old life truly was, and how easily a single instinct could bring the whole careful structure down. She met Alaric Vane 3 years later at an assembly in Bath, when Mrs. Pemberton, by then frail and determined to see her ward settled before she died, all but pushed Wynne into his path. He was not what she expected of a duke. He was quiet in crowded rooms, watchful in a way she recognized because it matched her own, and when he spoke to her for the first time, a clumsy comment about the dreadful orchestra, there was an awkwardness in it that felt, oddly, like honesty. "You watch the room like you are counting exits," he said to her later that same evening on a terrace lit by lanterns. "And you watch it like you're counting threats." Something crossed his face. Surprise, recognition, the particular jolt of being seen by a stranger. "Perhaps we are both tired of performing," he said quietly. She did not tell him that her performance went deeper than his. She only smiled and let him believe that the calm, composed, faintly melancholy young woman beside him had been born into the careful world she now lived in, rather than having built it herself, plank by plank, the way her father had once built a boat, out of necessity, out of love, out of the desperate hope that it would hold. They met again 3 weeks later at a dinner in Bath, and this time Alaric sought her out before the soup had even been served. "I have thought about you more than is sensible for a man who spoke to you for perhaps 10 minutes, he admitted, with the particular awkwardness of a man unused to admitting anything. "My mother will say I am being hasty. My mother says that about most things I do." There was something in the way he said it, a flicker of old hurt beneath the dry humor, that told Wynne this was not the first time he had disappointed someone simply by wanting something for himself. She recognized it because she carried a version of the same wound, and for a moment, sitting across from a duke in candlelight, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope that she might, for once, be loved for exactly who she was, before remembering with a small cold jolt that he did not yet know who that was. His proposal, when it came 2 months later, was nothing like the practiced speeches she had heard described in other women's courtships. He found her in Mrs. Pemberton's small garden, removed his hat, turned it once in his hands the way nervous men do, and said simply, "I'm not skilled at saying difficult things, so I will only say this once and trust you to believe I mean it. I would like to spend the rest of my life finding out what else is underneath your composure, if you will let me." Wynne had looked at him for a long moment, weighing the enormity of what she was about to agree to, and the lie she would be agreeing to carry alongside it, before finally saying yes, meaning with her whole heart the part of the promise that was true, and quietly bearing the part that was not. Mrs. Pemberton died 11 months after the wedding, content, holding Wynne's hand, the only person alive who knew the whole truth, taking it with her into the ground. Wynne remembered the wedding itself in fragments, the way people remember the most important days of their lives, not as a single clear scene, but as a handful of small, vivid pieces. The smell of orange blossom, the weight of her grandmother's borrowed pearls, which were not her grandmother's at all, but Mrs. Pemberton's, lent with a wink and a whispered, "Let them wonder." Alaric's hand, steady and warm, closing around hers at the altar, and the way he had leaned close just before the vows and murmured, "You look terrified," not unkindly, and she had answered, "I am always a little terrified," and meant it more truly than he could have known. She stood at her second funeral in 4 years and understood that the lie was no longer hers to maintain alone. It was now woven into a marriage, a title, a household of 60 servants who called her Your Grace and curtsied to a story that had never been true. She loved her husband. She had not expected to, and it had crept up on her slowly, the way affection does between two careful people. But love, she was learning, did not dissolve guilt. It only gave guilt somewhere new to hide. Marrowmere Hall had a rule that no one had ever written down, and everyone obeyed without question. The Duke did not go near the river. Wynne noticed it within her first month of marriage. Garden parties were arranged on the lawn, but never along the bank itself. Fishing, which every other great house for 50 miles practiced as casual sport, was never mentioned at Marrowmere. Once, in her first spring there, she had suggested a picnic by the water and watched Alaric's jaw tighten so fast and so completely that she had changed the subject before he even answered. "He does not speak of his father," the housekeeper, Mrs. Quill, told her once carefully, the way servants tell their mistress things they are not quite supposed to. "The old Duke drowned in that river 18 years ago, Your Grace. His Grace was 14. He was on the bank. He saw the whole of it." Nobody told her more than that, and she did not ask, because asking felt like prying open a door that had been nailed shut for a reason, and because, though she would not have admitted this even to herself, some part of her recognized the particular shape of a grief that chose silence over speech, the way she recognized her own face in a dim mirror. In 3 years of marriage, Alaric had told her almost nothing about the day his father died. He told her about ledgers, about tenant disputes, about his mother's opinions on nearly everything, in long, careful, controlled paragraphs that never once cracked open into feeling. He was, Wynne had come to understand, a man who had learned exactly the lesson she had learned, that grief, properly managed, looked like composure, and composure was safer than the truth. She had watched him, more than once, walk straight past a weeping tenant or a grieving servant with a brief, awkward nod, only to quietly send money or send for the physician an hour later, as though kindness embarrassed him more than cruelty ever could. It had taken her a full year of marriage to understand that this was not coldness. It was a man who had been taught, very young, that feeling things out loud was the first step toward losing control of everything, and who therefore did all his feelings silently, afterward, alone. It was not all distance, in 3 years. There were quiet evenings in the small sitting room when he read aloud to her from whatever dull agricultural pamphlet had crossed his desk that week, doing the voices of disapproving tenant farmers until she laughed despite herself, and Sunday mornings when he would bring her tea before she woke simply because he liked watching her face when she first opened her eyes. He was, in the small unguarded hours no one else witnessed, a far gentler man than the composed Duke the world saw, and Wynne had come to treasure those hours more than she let herself admit, precisely because they felt like glimpses of a man who might, if given enough reason, learn to be unguarded everywhere. There was a portrait of the old Duke in the long gallery, a stern, broad-shouldered man with Alaric's same watchful eyes, and Wynne had once come upon her husband standing before it late at night, a single candle in his hand, simply looking. She had not spoken, had not let him know she was there at all, and had watched him stand motionless for nearly 10 minutes before finally murmuring, so quietly she almost did not catch it, "I still don't know if I hate you or miss you more." Then he had turned, seen her in the doorway, and the shutters had come down over his face so completely that she had never once been able to raise the subject again. The Dowager Duchess. Theodora ran the household with the precision of a woman defending territory she had fought hard to keep. She was never openly cruel to Wynne, only relentlessly, exhaustingly correct, correcting her posture, her vowels, the placement of her hands at dinner, with a thoroughness that suggested, more than once, that she was looking for something specific and had not yet found it. "You have remarkably strong hands for a lady," Theodora observed once, examining Wynne's grip on a teacup with an expression Wynne could not quite read. "Wherever did you learn to hold things so firmly?" "My governess was very particular, Your Grace," Wynne had answered smoothly, and watched the dowager's eyes narrow by the smallest possible degree, the way a hawk's eyes narrow at a shape in tall grass that might be nothing, might be everything. It was. Not the first time. There had been a winter evening, early in the marriage, when Wynne had absently hummed a few bars of a tune while mending a torn hem in the sitting room, a ferryman's working song, the kind sung to keep rhythm while poling against current, learned so young she did not even remember learning it, and had looked up to find Theodora watching her with an expression of pure, startled calculation, as though a familiar painting had just shown her an unfamiliar brushstroke underneath. "What a curious little song," the dowager had said very lightly. "Wherever does one's governess teach such a thing?" Wynne had laughed it off and never hummed in that room again, but she had felt ever since the particular cold awareness of being watched by someone patient enough to wait years for the truth to surface on its own. There had been a baby once, in the 2nd year. Wynne did not speak of it, even to herself, except in the smallest hours of the night when she could not stop herself. It had not lived long enough to be named, and afterward Alaric had sat beside her bed for 3 days without leaving, holding her hand in a silence so complete it had felt strangely like the truest thing he had ever offered her, closer to honesty than any sentence he had spoken in their marriage. She remembered the particular quality of his silence those 3 days. Not absence, but presence so total it had no need of words. He had not told her it would be all right, because he did not know that it would be, and he had never once pretended otherwise. On the 4th morning he had simply risen, kissed her forehead, and gone back to his ledgers, and she had understood, watching him go, that he had folded the grief away exactly as he folded everything else, carefully, completely, and utterly alone. The morning of the midsummer fete arrived grey and humid, the river already swollen from a week of upstream rain, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and coming weather. A letter came for Wynne at breakfast, sealed with the mark of Mrs. Pemberton's old solicitor, and her stomach dropped before she had even broken the wax. She read it standing by the window, her face arranging itself into careful nothing by long, well-practiced habit. A debt of Mrs. Pemberton's, long thought settled, had resurfaced. A creditor was making inquiries about the late Mrs. Pemberton's niece, and where precisely that niece had truly come from. She stood there a long while after reading it, watching the gardeners below setting out chairs for the fete, and felt the particular vertigo of a woman watching 2 entirely different lives prepare to occupy the same afternoon. One life made of silk and string quartets and careful smiles, and another older life made of debt and rivers, and a name she had not spoken aloud in 11 years. Both of them suddenly, dangerously close to colliding. She told herself, as she had told herself 100 times before, that it was only a letter, that creditors made inquiries and were answered and went quiet again, that nothing today would be any different from any other day she had survived by simply not flinching. Wynne folded the letter into a small, tight square and slid it into her sleeve as the first guests' carriages began crunching up the long drive. She had no way of knowing, dressing in sky-blue silk an hour later, gloves smoothed careful over hands that had once gripped a ferryman's pole, that within the hour none of it would matter, because a girl was about to go under the water on the lawn below, and Wynne Vane was about to remember, in front of 200 witnesses, exactly who she had always been. Nobody on the lawn moved for 3 full seconds after the girl spoke. Then everyone moved at once, the silence breaking into chaos. Guests crowding forward with blankets and brandy, a footman shouting for the physician, the orchestra, absurdly, still playing somewhere up near the terrace as if nothing in the world had changed. Wynne scooped the shivering girl into her arms before anyone could take her, soaked silk and soaked grey cotton pressed together, and carried her up the lawn herself, refusing every offered pair of hands because some old instinct in her, older than this house, older than this name, would not let go of a drowning child a second time in her life without finishing the job properly. "What's your name?" she asked low, just for the girl, as they climbed the slope toward the house. "Linnet," the girl whispered through chattering teeth. "Linnet Crane." The name meant nothing to Wynne. It meant a great deal to the Dowager Duchess, who had followed 3 paces behind the entire way up the lawn, her face the color of cold ash, her hands gripping her skirt so tightly the silk had begun to crease permanently. They put Linnet in a small guest room normally reserved for visiting ladies' maids, and Wynne would not leave her side, even as Mrs. Quill tried gently to suggest that the Duchess change out of her ruined gown. Below stairs, the household had already begun to whisper. The under-housemaids had seen the dive from the kitchen garden and could not stop describing it to each other, half in awe, half in scandal. The young footman who had reached the water too late kept silently replaying the moment in his mind, certain he would be blamed for hesitating, though no one had said a word to him about it. Even Mr. Pevensey, the butler, who prided himself on having seen everything in 30 years of service and being surprised by nothing, found himself standing motionless in the corridor for a full minute after the news reached him, simply trying to picture it. The physician arrived within the hour, a brisk, no-nonsense man named Dr. Aldous, who had delivered half the village and buried the other half, and who examined Linnet with the businesslike gentleness of someone who had seen enough frightened children to know exactly how to put one at ease. "Lungs are clear, Your Grace," he told Wynne afterward in the corridor, lowering his voice. "She's thin as a winter hedge, mind, and there's an old bruise on her ribs that's healed wrong, weeks old, nothing to do with tonight. Whoever's been feeding that child hasn't been feeding her enough, and whoever's watching her hasn't been watching close." Wynne absorbed this with a stillness that did not match the fury building underneath it, and resolved in that moment that whatever else happened, Linnet would never again go a single day hungry or unwatched while she had breath left to prevent it. "In a moment," Wynne said, not looking up, pressing warmed blankets around the girl's thin shoulders. Alaric appeared in the doorway and stood there a long time without entering, watching his wife, still dripping, still in silk gone the color of mud at the hem. Tender stranger's child with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this exact thing before, many times in another life he knew nothing about. Win! His voice was careful, stripped of the panic from the lawn, replaced now with something quieter and more dangerous. Control, rebuilt brick by brick. A word, when you are able. She is 11 years old and nearly drowned an hour ago, Alaric. I am able when she is warm. He did not argue. He simply stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching, and Wynne felt his attention on her like a held breath, the particular weight of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. He left eventually, without the conversation he'd come for, and walked the length of the gallery twice before he allowed himself to stop and lean against the cold stone wall, his heart still hammering from the lawn, from the water, from the sight of his wife disappearing beneath brown current with a calm he had never once seen her show at a dinner table. He kept replaying the exact moment she had pulled free of his grip, not frightened, not reckless, but certain, the way a person is only certain about something they have done before. He did not yet have words for what he was feeling. He only knew it sat somewhere between terror and a strange, unwilling awe, and that he had spent 3 years believing he understood the shape of his own marriage, and had just watched that shape dissolve into water in under a minute. Much later that night, once Lynette had finally fallen into the heavy, twitching sleep of a child whose body has been through more than it could process awake, Wynne sat alone in the dim room and allowed herself, for the first time since the lawn, to shake. Not from cold, she had warmed hours ago, but from the sheer delayed weight of how close it had come, how easily this could have been a different story entirely, one with a small grey-clad body pulled from the water too late instead of in time. She pressed her own trembling hands flat against her knees the way her father used to press his against the side of the ferryboat in rough water, a habit she had not realized she still carried until that exact moment, 13 years and an entire false life later. Lynette, once warmed, once given broth, she drank with the desperate speed of a child who had not eaten a proper meal in some time, began to cry. Not from fear, but from something older and heavier. "Where's my da?" she said, not quite a question, the words coming out flat, already knowing. "Sweetheart," Wynne said gently, kneeling by the bed. "Is there someone we can send for?" "Your mother. He's dead." Lynette said it the way children say unbearable things when they have said them too many times already, all the grief worn down to a flat, exhausted fact. Silas Crane. He worked the barges on the Esk before. He died 3 winters back. Mum died after, of the fever. My aunt has me now, but she's got 6 of her own and no room, and I was only down by the water because I was meant to be fetching her washing what the flood took, and I slipped and... She stopped, looking up at Wynne with sudden, sharp clarity, the exhaustion in her face cracking just enough to let something fierce through. "You really are river folk, aren't you? I knew it the second you went in. Gentry don't swim like that. Gentry don't swim at all, mostly. My da used to say it. He said the river doesn't care what you're called, only what you know." Across the room, Theodora made a small sound, not quite a word, and gripped the doorframe. "Silas Crane," she repeated very quietly, as though testing whether saying the name aloud would make something true that she had spent 18 years insisting was not. Alaric, who had returned to the doorway at the sound of his mother's voice, looked between her stricken face and the small, exhausted girl in the bed with an expression of complete confusion. He had never heard the name Silas Crane in his life, not once, in 27 years, and yet his mother was gripping the doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping her upright, and something in her face, old grief, older guilt, looked for just a moment exactly like the expression he caught sometimes in his own mirror. Wynne looked up, caught the strange, stricken look passing between the dowager and her son, and understood, with the first cold prickle of real fear, that she had just pulled a thread connected to something far older and far more dangerous than her own secret, and that the river, true to its nature, was not finished giving up what it had buried. By Tuesday, all of London society knew about the Duchess of Marrowmere who swam. The Esk Hollow Gazette ran a small, vicious illustration on its second page. A woman in a soaked gown, hair streaming, captioned, "Her Grace or Her Trade." And by Thursday it had been copied into 3 London papers, each one a little crueler than the last, each one asking the same poisoned question with different words. "Where does a lady learn to swim like that?" Wynne read them standing in the morning room, her face very still, while Hetty, her lady's maid and the only servant who had come with her from Mrs. Pemberton's house, hovered nearby with the particular anxiety of someone who knew more of the truth than anyone else alive. Hetty had been a scullery girl at Mrs. Pemberton's house long before Wynne arrived and had watched the transformation happen in real time, had helped lace Wynne into her first proper gown, had practiced curtsies with her in the kitchen after the other servants had gone to bed, had never once, in 9 years, let slip a single detail of where her mistress had truly come from, not to other servants, not to a sweetheart, Not even to her own mother. She had done it not out of duty, but out of something closer to fierce private love, the kind that asks for nothing in return except the privilege of keeping someone else's most dangerous secret safe. "They're only papers, Your Grace," Hetty offered quietly. "They'll forget by autumn." "They will forget the story," Wynne said. "They will not forget the question." Invitations thinned that week in the particular polite, devastating way society excludes someone without ever quite admitting it is doing so. 2 dinners were regrettably postponed. A garden visit was, perhaps, better suited to next season. Lady Cordelia Ashworth, who had once fought for a seat beside Wynne at every dinner for a year, now found herself extraordinarily occupied each time Wynne entered a room. At church that Sunday, 3 families who had sat near the vain pew for as long as Wynne had been married quietly arranged to be elsewhere, and the vicar's wife, who had once praised the Duchess's charity work from the pulpit, now offered only a tight, apologetic smile before hurrying her children past. It was not cruelty exactly. It was the slow, careful withdrawal of people who did not wish to be standing too close when something finally, fully collapsed. Outside the milliner's shop that same afternoon, Lady Cordelia Ashworth finally cornered her directly, 2 companions flanking her like an audience assembled for a performance. "I do hope the little Crane girl is recovering well," Cordelia said, in a voice pitched for the whole street to hear. "Such a remarkable rescue, Your Grace. One almost forgets to ask how a woman raised in drawing rooms came to swim like a Thames waterman, almost." Wynne held her gaze, said nothing she would regret, and walked on with her chin level and her hands steady. But the question followed her home anyway, the way the worst questions always do, settling into the corners of every room she entered for the rest of the week. Alaric heard a version of the same question that same week at his club, from a viscount who meant it as gentle ribbing and clearly expected Alaric to laugh along. "Your Duchess swims rather better than my groom, Marrowmere. Wherever did the gentry hide that particular skill all these years?" Whatever doubt was still tangled up in Alaric's own chest, he found in that moment that he had no patience whatsoever for hearing his wife mocked by a man who had stood frozen on a riverbank, doing nothing while she pulled a drowning child from the water. "She swims better than every man on that lawn combined," Alaric said, flatly enough that the Viscount's smile faltered. "Myself included. I'd think carefully before you make a joke of the one person at that fete who actually did something." He left the club early that evening, unsettled by how easily the defense had come, before he had even finished deciding what he believed. Alaric found her that Thursday evening in the library, the Gazette open on the desk before her, and for once he did not retreat into the careful, managed sentences that had carried their entire marriage. "You swim like you were born to it," he said, not a question. "I was taught young." It was technically true. She did not look up. "By whom?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me that my wife dove into a flooded river without an instant's hesitation, while 200 guests stood paralyzed on the bank, and that the only explanation anyone seems able to offer is the one the papers are printing." His voice had risen, just slightly, the first true crack she had ever heard in it. "It matters to me that I have been married to you for 3 years, and I am only now realizing I do not know who I married. You know who I am, Alaric. I am the woman who has sat across from you at 4,000 breakfasts. I am the woman who held your hand for 3 days when we lost—" Her voice broke just once, sharply. "When we lost our daughter, and never once asked you to perform a single feeling you weren't ready to show me. That is who I am. Whether or not I can swim does not change it." Something in his face wavered, the old grief surfacing dangerously close to the new suspicion, the 2 griefs tangling together the way they always do in a man who has spent his whole life keeping them carefully apart. "My father drowned in that river," he said very low. "I watched it happen. I was 14 years old, standing on the bank, and I did not move, because I had been told my entire life that veins do not go in the water, that it was beneath us, that it was reckless, that it was for people who had nothing else to lose. I have spent 18 years believing that obedience saved my life that day, and then I watched my wife dive into the exact same river without a second of that obedience and survive and save a child, and I do not know anymore whether I am furious that you frightened me or furious that you proved I might have spent my whole life being a coward for nothing." The library went very quiet. Outside, rain had begun again, soft against the tall windows, the river somewhere beyond them rising another careful inch. "You are not a coward," Wynne said softly. "You were a child who was told a lie about what courage looks like." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing behind his eyes. And then, as he always did, he folded it carefully away, straightened his shoulders, and the Duke returned, composed and distant. "My mother wants the Crane girl sent to a parish workhouse before the week is out," he said. She says keeping her here only feeds the scandal. And what do you want? He did not answer. He simply looked at her. Really looked. The way he had on that terrace in Bath years ago. And walked out of the library without another word. Wynne sat alone with the Rain and the Gazette for a long while after, turning his unanswered question over in her mind. And what do you want? He had not answered it for himself, but she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the scandal ever could, that the real question underneath it was simpler and far more dangerous. Did he want a wife who told the truth, even if the truth cost him everything he had built his composure around? She didn't know yet whether he was the kind of man who could survive that answer. She only knew, watching the rain streak down the tall windows, that she was no longer willing to spend the rest of her life protecting him from finding out. She was left in the end with only the growing, terrible certainty that the truth, once it started moving, was a current no one in this house would be able to stop. Wynne found Lynette on the third morning sitting cross-legged on the guest bed, methodically folding and unfolding the corner of a blanket, her thin shoulders hunched in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're not eating?" Wynne said, settling beside her. "Don't feel right, eating soup off plates with gold on the edge when my aunt's lot are eating bread and water back home." Lynette did not look up. "Don't feel right being here at all, truth told. Like I'm a fish what got caught in the wrong net." "You saved my life by accident," Wynne said. "Allow me to return the favor on purpose. That's all this is." It was not entirely the whole truth. Wynne had not expected to feel anything in particular toward this thin, sharp-tongued stranger beyond ordinary duty. And yet some quiet, unexpected tenderness had crept up on her in the 3 days since the river. The same protective ache she had once felt watching a small brother learn to float, returned now with nowhere to go and a girl who badly needed somewhere to put it. She found herself lingering in the guest room longer than necessary, finding small reasons to return, watching Lynette eat with the fierce, unself-conscious hunger of a child who has gone without too often, and feeling something in her own chest loosen, very slightly, for the first time in years. The previous evening, without quite meaning to, Wynne had ended up sitting on the edge of the bed braiding Lynette's tangled hair while the girl complained about the comb, and somewhere in the middle of it Lynette had begun, unprompted, teaching Wynne a counting rhyme bargemen's children used to call out the depth of the water at the locks. Wynne had known the very same rhyme as a girl, word for word, and had to look away quickly so Lynette would not see her face do something it had no business doing in front of a child she had known for 3 days. Lynette's eyes flicked up, sharp and assessing in a way that reminded Wynne, uncomfortably, of herself at that age. "You talk like gentry, but you swim like Hollow Reach. Which one's the lie?" It was the most direct anyone had come to the truth in 11 years, and Wynne felt the question land somewhere just beneath her ribs, sharp and unavoidable. She thought of every careful sentence she had built her whole adult life from, every vowel sanded smooth by Mrs. Pemberton's patient correction, and understood that this thin, exhausted child sitting cross-legged on a borrowed bed had seen through all of it in under 3 days simply by watching her move through water. There was something almost freeing in being seen so completely by someone with nothing to gain from exposing her. She was not ready yet to answer honestly, but she found to her own surprise that she wanted to. Wynne did not answer that. Instead, she asked very carefully, "Tell me about your father." And Lynette did, in fragments, the way children tell the stories that hurt most, circling the center of it for a long while before finally landing on it. Silas Crane had been a good bargeman, well-liked, steady, until the flood 18 years back that took the old Duke. After that, work dried up. Men who had hired him for years suddenly found other bargemen. He'd told Lynette once, drunk and weeping, the only time she ever saw him cry, that the family blamed him for something he didn't do, and that the blame had followed him like a smell he couldn't wash off until it drowned him slower than the river ever could have. "He never said what really happened," Lynette finished. "Just that nobody asked him. Just that the story got decided before he ever opened his mouth." That afternoon, Wynne went looking, not for her own secret this time, but for someone else's. She found Mrs. Quill in the linen room and asked as casually as she could manage what exactly had happened the day the old Duke died. Mrs. Quill's hands stilled over the folded sheets. "That's not really mine to tell, Your Grace." "Whose is it, then?" The housekeeper hesitated a long moment, then reached to the back of a high shelf and drew down a small, dust-furred wooden box Wynne had never seen before. "The old Duke kept a journal. Her Grace the Dowager had it locked away after he died. I only know because I was the one who found it under his desk, soaked through the week after the flood, and dried the pages myself so they wouldn't be lost entirely. I never told her. I kept a copy of what I could still read." "Why keep it at all, if it was so dangerous to have?" Wynne asked. Mrs. Quill's face, usually so composed, softened into something almost girlish. I was 17 the year he died, Your Grace, new to service and frightened of my own shadow. He was the only person in this house who ever once asked my name and remembered it the next morning. I could not bear the idea of every true word he ever wrote rotting forgotten in a drawer, simply because the truth embarrassed someone still living. Some things are worth a small risk to keep safe. Inside, in water-stained, barely legible ink, was a single surviving page, the handwriting old-fashioned and slanted. The crane boy went under near the mill race, and I could not stand on the bank and watch a second child taken from that family in one winter, not after the first, not when I had a boat and 2 strong arms and no excuse left. The page ended mid-sentence, the rest lost to water damage, but it was enough. It was more than enough. Wynne sat very still, the box open on her lap, and felt the whole shape of the old lie settle into place. A duke who had gone into the water to save a bargeman's drowning son. Exactly the kind of common act his own family considered beneath their name, and a family that, rather than honor a dead man's courage, had quietly let the blame fall on the grieving father instead, because a dead duke who drowned saving a poor child looked, to the wrong eyes, like a humiliation rather than a triumph. He was a hero, Wynne whispered, and they buried it twice, once in the ground and once in a locked box. She spent the rest of that day in the estate office, going through old wage ledgers with the same patient, methodical attention her father's tinker friend had once marveled at in a girl who understood numbers most grown men struggled with. She found what she expected to find. Silas Crane's name, steady and regular for years, vanishing abruptly from the payment rolls the very same month the old duke died, replaced within weeks by other bargemen at the same rate, as though an efficient, invisible hand had simply redirected the work elsewhere the moment it became inconvenient to remember why. There was no note explaining the change. There never needed to be. A great house did not have to announce a man's ruin. It only had to stop paying him and let the village draw its own conclusions. That evening, Hetty found her still sitting with the journal page and read the fear plainly on her mistress's face. "You're going to pull this thread, aren't you?" she said quietly. "Even knowing it runs straight back to your own." "If I stay silent to protect myself," Wynne said, "I become exactly the kind of person who let Silas Crane carry a blame that wasn't his for 18 years. I cannot save one drowning child and ignore another who's already dead and still drowning in a lie." "Then God help you," Hetty murmured, "because once that water starts moving, it won't ask permission about where it stops." The Dowager Duchess summoned Wynne to her private sitting room the next morning, and Wynne knew, the instant she saw Theodora's face, composed, but with a tightness around the eyes that no amount of practice could fully hide, that the conversation would not be about seating arrangements. She had felt it coming since dawn, in the particular way a person feels weather changing in an old injury long before the clouds arrive. She had lain awake half the night turning over the journal page, the ledgers, Linnet's flat, exhausted voice saying he never said what really happened, and had known, with the dull certainty of someone who had spent her whole life reading rooms for danger, that asking questions about one buried secret in a house like Marrowmere was never going to stay contained to that secret alone. She dressed slowly that morning, choosing her plainest gown as though plain wool might somehow armor her against whatever was coming. "You have been asking questions," Theodora said without preamble, "about a flood 18 years old. I have been trying to understand a girl who saved my life and lost her father to a story that doesn't hold together. Some stories are not meant to hold together under inspection. They are meant to hold a family together instead." Theodora rose and walked to the window, her back rigid. "My husband died acting like a common rescuer, in front of half the village, and I spent the rest of my life making certain that the story people remembered was a tragic accident, not a humiliating spectacle. You think I buried a hero. I buried a husband, and I protected the only thing he left behind that could still be protected, his son's name. At the cost of an innocent man's reputation, at the cost of that man's daughter going hungry. The world has always cost someone something, Wynne." Theodora turned, and for the first time her voice dropped its armor entirely, raw and tired underneath. "I knew the moment that child opened her mouth on the lawn that this house was about to be pulled apart by 2 old griefs colliding. I have spent 18 years keeping mine buried. I wonder," she said very softly, very precisely, "how long you have spent keeping yours." "You loved him," Wynne said quietly. It was not a question. Theodora's composure cracked, just barely, just for a moment. "I loved a man who could not stop himself from running toward danger, even when it cost him everything. And I spent 22 years married to him, terrified that exact quality would be the death of him, and then one wet October it was. I have hated the river every day since for taking him, and I have hated myself a little more every year for the lie I built to survive his absence. You think I am cruel. I am simply a woman who has been frightened for 18 years and has run out of better ways to manage it." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and dangerous. I don't know what you mean, Wynne said too carefully. I think you do. I think a woman does not learn to hold a teacup like a fist around an oar by accident. I think a lady's accent does not slip, just slightly, just once, when she is exhausted and frightened, the way yours did the night we lost the baby, when you called out for someone named Toby in your sleep, and I have wondered, quietly, ever since. Theodora's eyes were not cruel exactly. They were something worse, calculating. Send the Crane girl back to her aunt. Stop asking questions about my husband. Let both old griefs lie where they were buried, or I promise you I will find out exactly who Wynne Thorne was before she became Wynne Vane, and I will make certain my son hears it from someone other than you. Wynne stood very still, her heart slamming against her ribs, every careful year of performance screaming at her to bow, to comply, to save herself the only way she'd ever known how, by disappearing a little further into the lie. Instead, she thought of Tobias, 40 feet out in cold water, her fingers closing on nothing. She thought of Lynette's small, fierce face saying the river doesn't care what you're called, only what you know. She thought of a dead duke's unfinished sentence about a boy he could not stand to watch drown. She thought, too, of every year she had spent calculating the safest sentence, the safest expression, the safest version of herself to offer a room, and of how very tired she was, suddenly and completely, of all that careful arithmetic. Somewhere beneath the fear, a small, clear voice that sounded very much like her own 12-year-old self was asking her a simple question. What is the point of surviving if you spend the whole of your life too afraid to actually live in the body that survived? No, she said. Theodora blinked, genuinely startled. She had spent 18 years being the most formidable presence in any room she entered, and had not expected, of all people, a girl half her age with everything to lose to be the first person in nearly 2 decades to simply refuse her. I will not send that child away to protect either of our secrets, Wynne said, her voice steady even as her hands shook at her sides. I've spent my whole life being careful, Theodora. Careful got my brother killed because I hesitated half a second too long deciding whether to go in. Careful let an innocent man die poor and blame for something noble he never did. I am done being careful with the truth. You may tell your son whatever you like. I would rather he know exactly what I am and choose me anyway than spend one more year being loved by a man who only knows half a wife. She walked out before the dowager could answer, her legs unsteady, her chest tight with a fear so large it had no edges. Down the corridor, Lynette had been sitting on the floor outside the sitting room door, sent to fetch a shawl and forgotten there in the rush of raised voices, and had heard enough. A flood 18 years old, her father's name spoken like a curse, a threat about secrets and sending her back to her aunt's. To feel the old familiar floor of her world tilting again, the way it always seemed to right before something else was taken from her. She did not wait to hear the rest. She slipped down the back stair in her stocking feet, out through the kitchen garden gate, and into a wind that smelled like the inside of a storm cloud, walking toward the one sound in the whole frightening world that had ever felt like her father's voice. The river, low and rising, calling her the way it always had. Wynne, climbing the stairs toward her own room with no idea any of this was happening, had no way of knowing that the sky outside had already gone the color of a deep bruise, that the river had risen 4 feet since morning, or that the girl she had pulled from the water once already was, at that very moment, walking straight back toward it. The storm broke fully an hour after dark, rain coming sideways in sheets, the wind tearing the last of the Fate's bunting from its poles and flinging it across a lawn already going soft and treacherous underfoot. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, and the candles in the hall windows flickered each time the wind found a gap in the old stone. The household had retreated to the kitchens and the servants' hall, doors latched against the weather, and no one thought, in those first frightened minutes, to count the children twice. Mrs. Quill found Wynne first, breathless, candle guttering in the doorway. The Crane girl's bed is empty, Your Grace. Nobody's seen her since the storm started. Wynne did not stop to find a cloak. She was out the side door and into the rain within seconds, her gown soaked through before she had crossed the terrace, the river's roar already audible from 100 yards off, louder and angrier than she had ever heard it. She found Lynette by lightning, one bright, terrible flash that showed a small figure clinging to the same fallen branch from the Fate, except now the branch had broken free of the bank entirely, and the girl was being carried, slowly, inexorably, toward the dark water beyond. "Lynette!" Wynne's voice tore against the wind, barely a sound at all against the roar. "I just wanted to be near him," Lynette sobbed, barely audible, water streaming down her face that might have been rain or might have been tears. "My da loved the river even after it took everything from him. I thought if I came down here, I'd feel him again, and then the bank it just went..." Wynne went in without hesitation, the way she always did, the way she had been built to since she was 12 years old, with her hand flat under her brother's back. The current here was nothing like the gentle pull of the Fate day. It was a different animal entirely, swollen and furious, and within 3 strokes she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who knew rivers better than most, that she had misjudged it badly. Behind her on the lawn, lanterns were already bobbing through the rain. Mrs. Quill had not stopped to find her shawl either, and had sent a footman running for rope and 2 more for the stable hands, shouting Wynne's name into the storm with a fear in her voice the staff had never once heard from their composed housekeeper. None of it would arrive in time. Wynne knew this even as she fought the current, the same cold certainty she had felt 13 years ago watching her brother's small arms tire. Except this time, she promised herself, fighting for every inch. This time her arms would not stop moving until they reached the girl or gave out entirely. Behind her, on the bank, a figure was running through the rain, tall, coatless, his careful composure stripped away entirely by terror, screaming her name into a wind that ate the sound whole. Alaric reached the water's edge and stopped. 18 years collapsed into a single half-second. He saw his father's hand disappearing beneath brown water. He saw himself at 14, frozen on this exact bank, obedient, careful, alive, and hating himself for it every day since. He saw his wife, his actual wife, not the calm performance of her, the real woman underneath, the one who swam like a river-born thing, being pulled toward the same black current that had taken everything from this family once already. Dukes do not swim, 18 years of his mother's voice said inside his skull, one final time. Then I will not be a duke tonight, he said aloud to no one, and went in. The cold hit him like a wall, and for one paralyzing instant his body simply stopped, every old fear screaming at once. And then he thought of Wynne's voice in the library. You were a child who was told a lie about what courage looks like, and something in him broke open and let him move. He was not graceful. He thrashed where she glided, fought the water where she had long ago learned to bargain with it, but he reached her, reached them both, just as the current swept Linnet's small fingers loose from the branch entirely. For one unbearable instant, the girl simply vanished beneath the surface, swallowed whole by the dark, and Wynne felt the whole world narrow to that single black patch of water where a child had been a heartbeat ago and now was not. She dove again without a thought for her own. Exhausted arms, found nothing, dove again, and on the 3rd desperate reach, her fingers closed around a fistful of soaked grey cotton. She surfaced with Linnet's head finally, blessedly, above the water once more, coughing and screaming and alive. But the current had not finished with them. It caught them both broadside and dragged them toward the deeper channel where the mill race once stood, the same stretch of water, though neither of them knew it yet, where a different child had gone under 18 years before. Wynne's arms had nothing left to give. She felt her grip on Linnet's collar beginning to slip, felt the cold finally winning the long argument her body had been having with it since she first went in, and in that single suspended second, with the rain screaming and the river roaring and her strength burning down to its very last ember, she understood exactly how her brother must have felt, exactly how the old Duke must have felt, and she refused, with everything left in her, to let this be the same ending. I have you! Alaric's voice cut through the dark, closer now than she expected, rough with effort and fear. I have you both. Don't let go yet. Not yet. Alaric's arm closed around both of them at once, one hand fisted in his wife's soaked sleeve, the other dragging Linnet against his chest, and he kicked toward the bank with a strength born entirely of terror and love, and 18 years of unspent courage finally spending itself all at once. The bank seemed impossibly far, and twice the current nearly tore Linnet from his grip, and twice he simply tightened his hold and kept kicking, until at last his knee struck solid mud, and he understood, with a disbelief that nearly stopped his heart all over again, that they had actually made it. They came out of the water in a tangle of limbs and gasping breath, collapsing onto the mud as the storm raged on above them, and for a long moment none of them could do anything but breathe. 3 survivors of 3 different floods, finally, impossibly, on the same side of the water. It was Linnet, coughing, shaking, who said it first, staring up at Alaric with wide, startled eyes. You went in, she said. A duke went in the water. And Alaric, soaked to the bone, his hands still shaking, his wife's fingers locked tight in his, looked toward the dark river that had haunted him for 18 years, and finally, for the first time in his life, said the truth out loud. My father went in too, he said. He was a hero, and we let everyone believe he was a fool. I am done believing that lie. I am done with every lie this family has ever told to feel safe. Lightning flashed once more, far off now, the worst of the storm already rolling past toward the hills, and in its brief white light Wynne saw her husband's face clearly for what felt like the first time in 3 years of marriage, not composed, not careful, not performing dignity for anyone watching, but simply entirely human, undone and unafraid of being seen that way. Somewhere behind them, on the lawn, lanterns were finally arriving, too late to have helped and exactly in time to witness the three of them sitting in the mud in the dying rain, alive and changed, and no longer pretending to be anything other than what they actually were. They carried Lynette inside first, wrapped in every blanket the household could find, and it was Mrs. Quill, hovering anxiously by the fire, who finally said what no one else had dared to yet. "Her Grace the Dowager is in the hall, Your Grace. She heard everything from the terrace. She saw you go in." Theodora stood in the doorway of the drawing room, rain-soaked despite never having left the house, her composed face finally completely undone. She looked at her son, dripping, shaking, alive, and at the bargeman's daughter wrapped in blankets by the fire, and at Wynne, who stood between them both like a bridge built out of two rivers finally allowed to meet. "I have spent 18 years protecting a lie that nearly cost me my son tonight," Theodora said, her voice cracking apart at last. "Your father went into that water because he could not bear to watch a child drown twice in one winter. I let the world believe Silas Crane was careless, because admitting your father had acted like a common man felt, to me, like losing him twice. I was wrong. I have been wrong for 18 years, and I am sorry, more than I know how to say in a room full of people who deserve so much better than my pride." Lynette, small and exhausted by the fire, looked up. "My da used to say, sorry doesn't fill an empty larder, but it's a start, I suppose." It was. Everyone in that room understood exactly the kind of honest, unvarnished forgiveness only a child who has lost everything can offer freely. Hetty, who had stood quietly by the door through all of it, finally allowed herself to weep. Not from sorrow, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of watching a secret she had guarded for years finally set down, after so long, without destroying the woman who carried it. "I kept waiting for the day it would all fall apart," she admitted later, pressing Wynne's hands between her own. "I never once imagined it might fall together instead." Alaric turned to his wife then, and the room seemed to fall away around them, the fire, the rain still hammering the windows, his mother's quiet weeping, Lynette's exhausted breathing, until there was only the two of them, soaked and shaking and entirely, finally visible to each other. "Hollow Reach," he said quietly. "That's where you're from, isn't it? Not distant gentry. A boatman's daughter, same as the girl on the lawn." Wynne did not flinch, did not reach for the old careful sentence that would soften it. "My father was a ferryman. My brother drowned when I was 12 because I hesitated half a second too long, and I've spent my entire life since being the woman who never hesitates again, dressed up in silk so no one would ask why. I married you believing the lie would keep me safe. I am done believing safety and truth cannot live in the same house." He crossed the room and took her face in both his shaking hands, rainwater and river water both still dripping from his hair onto her own. "All these years," he said, his voice unsteady, "I thought I had married someone fragile, someone I was meant to protect from every hard thing the world might throw at her. I built our whole marriage around that idea, without ever once asking if it was true. It was never true, was it? You were never the one who needed protecting in this house." He laughed, short and disbelieving, the sound of a man recalculating an entire decade in a single breath. "You have been the strongest person in this family the whole time, and I spent 3 years quietly congratulating myself for being gentle with you. I went into that water tonight because of you," he said. "Not despite what you are, because of it. You taught me, without ever meaning to, exactly what courage actually looks like, and it does not look like standing very still and calling it dignity. I do not love a duchess, Wynne. I never did. I love a woman who swims like the river itself, and I'm only sorry it took me 3 years and 1 flood to finally say so." The Esk Hollow Gazette ran a different story the following week, this one true, of a duke who had drowned saving a bargeman's son, and of a bargeman wrongly blamed for 18 years, and of his daughter, alive and safe at Marrowmere Hall, where the new Duchess had personally seen to it that the Crane family's name was cleared in every record the estate held, and that Lynette would never again wonder where her next meal was coming from. The solicitor's letter that had so frightened Wynne the morning of the fete arrived again, a second time, a week after the storm, and this time she handed it to Alaric without a single moment of hesitation. He read it standing by the same window where she had once folded it into her sleeve, then set it down and said only, "I'll settle whatever Mrs. Pemberton's estate still owes, and you will never receive another letter like this one again." There was no anger in it, no performance of magnanimity, only the simple, steady competence of a husband handling an old debt that had nothing left to threaten him, now that the secret beneath it had already come into the light. A fortnight after that, Alaric and Wynne sat together with Lynette's aunt, a tired, kind woman who wept with relief rather than reluctance when they offered to make Lynette a permanent ward of Marrowmere Hall, admitting quietly that she had been lying awake nights wondering how she would feed one more mouth come winter. Lynette herself was asked directly and seriously whether this was what she wanted, because Wynne had decided long before that morning that no one would ever again decide this girl's life around her without asking. Lynette considered it with the gravity of someone twice her age, looked between the Duke, the Duchess, and the river visible through the window, and said simply, "I'd like to stay near the water. And near you. I suppose that's the same thing now." It was settled within the month, with far less ceremony and far more tears than anyone expected. A month later, Alaric stood on the riverbank where his father had died, and had a small stone marker set into the earth, plain and unadorned, bearing two names instead of one, Cassian Vane, and beneath it, Silas Crane, the man whose son he had died trying to save. The old bargeman who still worked the Esk came to see it, hats in hand, and one grey-haired man who had known Silas since boyhood wept openly at the foot of it, saying only, "Took 18 years, but the river always tells the truth eventually if you wait long enough to hear it." Lynette stood beside the stone for a long while that afternoon, her small hand resting on her father's carved name, and when she finally turned away, something in her face had settled that had not been settled since the day he died. Society, predictably, found a new story to gossip about within a fortnight. Wynne found she no longer cared. On a clear morning the following spring, with the river running gentle and green again, Alaric stood at the water's edge in his shirt sleeves, visibly nervous, while his wife waded in ahead of him, laughing, her hand outstretched. Hetty watched from the bank that morning too, no longer needing to guard a secret that had finally, mercifully, stopped being dangerous, and found herself laughing along with the rest of them at the sight of a duke flailing gently in water no deeper than his waist. Mrs. Quill brought a basket of bread and cold ham down to the grass, declaring that a household could not properly celebrate anything without food close at hand, and even Theodora came eventually, settling into a chair someone had carried down for her, watching her son in the water with an expression that had finally, after 18 years, stopped flinching at the sight of it. "Dukes do swim, you know," she called back to him, sunlight catching the water around her exactly the way it had caught the rain the night everything finally became true. "It only took someone telling you the truth for you to find out," Wynne thought, treading water in the warm spring current with her husband splashing toward her, and a girl who was no longer a stranger laughing on the bank, of her brother 40 feet out in a different river a lifetime ago, and understood at last that she had not spent these years honoring his memory by staying careful and small. She had honored him every single time she went in anyway, every time she chose to be the person who moved instead of the person who watched from the bank. Somewhere, she liked to think, a freckled 9-year-old boy was glad of it. And Lynette, sitting on the bank with her bare feet in the shallows, a permanent ward of Marrowmere Hall now, with a room of her own and a future no longer measured in hunger, watched the Duke take his first uncertain stroke through water that had once been his family's deepest fear, and laughed out loud, bright, unguarded, entirely free, at the simple, astonishing sight of a man finally letting the river hold him up instead of pulling him under. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story.